Having played the Arknights Endfield CBT now for a few days, I think I am ready to compile all my first impressions, my thoughts and feedback. So that's what I'm doing right here and now while writing this script. This first impressions or review will be spoiler free and all B-roll footage will be me randomly running through the world, solving puzzles, collecting resources or doing some factory stuff. Which also means you can have this video running in the background while doing your dailies or trying to sleep. Before we start, a few things about me. Unless you are a frequent viewer of mine, you probably don't know who I am, nor my background going into the Endfield beta. I don't know anything about the Arknights IP, nor have I ever played Factorio or similar games. Games I have played include, but are not limited to, Honkai Star Rail, Genshin Impact, Wuthering Waves, Reverse 1999, Zenless Zone Zero, who I mainly currently make guide videos for, as well as various non-gacha games such as TFT, League of Legends, Elden Ring or Don't Starve. All of this basically means I am very familiar with the gacha genre, but also with other games and genres outside of that. Lastly, this is the first CBT, and while the game looks already incredibly finished, that doesn't mean there won't be any changes going forwards, because I am sure there will be. That being said, let's get into the first impressions and let's start with the story. Again, this will be spoiler free, I will only give you my thoughts on the story and my impressions, not what actually happens inside. The beginning of the game has had me captured very quickly, not only by fantastic and interesting visuals, but also the way of how the story was told in the first place. And that being a mix between epic cutscenes, well-paced combat and exploration gameplay, as well as our typical visual novel-alike type of storytelling. However, compared to most gacha games, well, the other ones I've played at least so far, the characters have been super well animated even during the visual novel type of scenes, and listening to the English voice actors has been honestly a great experience for me as well. Unfortunately, this has not really been the case for our MC. While others such as Perlica and Chen have had great and lively animations, our administrator often ended up being mute while referring back to the same three kinds of poses and animations. This felt a little bit disconnecting compared to the rest of the cast, at least to me. In the case of Perlica, while her animations have been fantastic, she also consistently featured a very calm and monotone voice, and while I understand that this might be by design, let's be honest, it probably is, it feels incredibly off when Perlica goes, "Yes, Ant-Man, let's hurry, people are in danger, we have no time to lose." Unfortunately for the story, it kinda lost me somewhere after the first 1 or 2 hours. While being initially well paced, it felt very slow to me afterwards. I know this is mostly done for world building and not necessarily a bad thing, but the difference and jump in pacing between the first 2 chapters felt super awkward to me. Skipping forwards, most of the quests have been about building our base and 80% of the entire main quest has basically been a tutorial. This is actually not a negative thing, because for someone like me who has no idea about how these factory type of games actually work, this has been incredibly helpful, especially because there's a lot of information we have to process. However, it also means that most of the story has been talk to person A, go collect B, then come back and talk to person A again. This continued mostly until halfway through chapter 3, which is when the story picked up again and not only featured some cool new gameplay elements, but also some really cool boss fights. So much for the story, let's talk about the world itself. Arknights Endfield is probably the best looking gacha game I have seen so far. That is probably also something you have heard from basically every single creator out there, and I think if everybody agrees on this, there probably is some truth to it. The game features incredibly luscious areas and are not only a joy to explore, but also to simply look at. However, that also comes at a cost. My PC is honestly relatively beefy, my specs are in the description, and while the performance has never been horrendous, there have been a few noticeable frame issues. Nothing breaking, but I do wonder how the game is supposed to run on mobile. Regardless, the game has had been well playable and mostly a steady 60 FPS, as that is the current cap anyway, but again, there have been some frame drops, well, depending on where you have been in the world. Anyway, I've had a ton of fun opening chests, collecting glowing orbs called Ethereum, which basically are the Anomalculus from Genshin or whatsoever, and solving various puzzles. The different one-time challenge domains have honestly not been very challenging, but very fun to do regardless, simply because it has been such a nice change of pace. The beta features currently 2 different regions, with the first region having 5 areas and the second region 1 area unlocked. The areas themselves have been pretty distinct and have also been to various degrees more or less linear. While the first area feels much more like an open world, other areas have been very streamlined with more or less limited exploration. This is not necessarily a negative point for me, but I do want to mention it for people who think that this is a real open world game, because it is not. Regardless of the areas, however, while there have been a few animals and fantasy creatures running around, well, next to the enemies of course, I think the world could feel a little bit more alive. Maybe just adding some more birds or something. This could also be done like using particle effects, so they are pretty cheap on the performance and can easily be adjusted, which means turned on or off in the settings. Speaking of particle effects and performance, let's quickly talk about fire. Do you see this? This is what happens when I turn the camera. The fire is a billboard which will always look at the camera. This is done mostly for performance, but it is honestly, it just looks incredibly cheap the moment you notice it, and it is really hard to unsee it afterwards. Sorry, I guess. Next, let's talk about the core gameplay loop and its difficulty. The game itself is a mixture between Genshin Impact, Wuthering Waves, Honkai Star Rail and Factorio. And I know this sounds weird, but let me explain. Endfield features a game mechanic called arts, which are similar to Genshin's elemental reactions, but you can also have react the same element with itself, which then does not trigger a reaction, but a so-called arts burst. The combat also features a perfect dodge mechanic, similar to Wuthering Waves or Zenless Zone Zero, but the feedback on whether or not you have been dodging successfully is honestly not super clear. As someone coming from Zenless Zone Zero, this honestly took me a long time to get used to, but after playing the game for many hours, and I'm talking about like 16 hours plus per day for multiple days straight, I got to like it more and more. There also is a mechanic similar to parrying, as in you have to cast your battle skill while the enemy is charging, which is indicated by this red circle, to interrupt them. We also have a stagger or toughness bar mechanic similar to the likes of Wuthering Waves or Honkai Star Rail, and furthermore there are QTEs, which can be activated when a specific condition is met, and these conditions can sometimes be very specific. This also means the team building aspect is much more important than the actual gameplay itself, or at least that has been my feeling so far. This is yet another aspect which felt very similar to Honkai Star Rail. You press the fun button when it glows, but to get the fun button to pop up in the first place, you must build your team correctly. There is much more to say about the combat, but this is a review or first impressions for the entire game and not a combat guide, so let me finish this part of the video by saying that I enjoyed the combat a lot, and it feels very different, for the better or the worse depending on your viewpoint, compared to other games such as Genshin or WoW. Lastly, one more thing, I actually forgot about this. To use your character's battle skills, you need skill points, which are shared across your team, again as an HSR. However, the skill points recover very slowly, especially early on. That can feel then very sluggish. While gear can somewhat alleviate the problem later into the game, the early game feels much more like a basic attack simulator, which can give a false impression of the game's combat system. Just throwing that out there. Next, that said, oh boy, here we go, Factorio. Well, kind of. The factory system is incredibly well integrated into the game and is necessary for weekly and daily as well as reoccurring tasks, as much as it is your primary way of crafting gear. As there is no RNG on the gear so far, this is honestly and fortunately a one-time thing, as in once your factory is running and self-sustaining, you basically get access to infinite gear. However, getting your factory, or should I say factories, running and self-sustaining, that is honestly a huge time sink and can cost you many days or possibly even weeks, depending on how well you want to optimize everything. And speaking of dailies, while your dailies are done pretty fast and honestly similar to other gacha games, there are still other tasks to do every day or so, such as manually farming various tier 5 mats which are needed for character ascensions. However, for the factory, let's just talk about it for a second, because it is extremely integrated and honestly the main gameplay of, this game. It's the main gameplay loop, which also means if you do not like the factory gameplay part, you will probably not like Arknights Endfield. You will spend days and days within this factory part, because otherwise you will be stuck even in between of the story, which we will come back to just a bit. But before we do, I know you're all waiting for it, so let's talk about the Gacha system. Coming from a background of mainly Hoyo games, I have to say Endfield system feels superior in every single way. Not only did I get a shit ton of free currency, which to be fair might be because it is the CBT, but being able to get the weapons on the side while only pulling for the characters felt honestly amazing. This also allowed me to use the premium currency for literally infinite refreshes of stamina, which might also be simply because it is the CBT, and I still have left hundreds of them. Speaking of which, said stamina is also mainly used for doing your daily domain runs for character experience and other materials, as it is common in every other gacha I've played. So let's get back to what I just said before. What about the progression? It felt a bit weird. I don't really know how to word it. If you do not have the necessary equipment, weapons and level for your characters, the game becomes incredibly challenging. And funnily enough, this is especially the case early into the game, where your entire party gets one hit from a level 15 enemy while you are level 10. But later in the game, you just one hit everything in the overworld yourself. The early game being harder than the end game is honestly a first to me. Speaking of which, the beta didn't really feature an endgame mode outside of a single roguelike, and while that one has been fun, it is very akin to HSR Simulated Universe. Not in the same sense as how it works, but in you will do it a few times and after a month or two it will just be your usual weekly chore, while also being incredibly easy to clear. However, I'm sure this will not be the only endgame mode, so we will have to wait for probably another beta or the release. For the last point, I wanna talk about the characters and their design, as well as the UI. This game has hands down the best UI I've ever seen in a gacha game. It not only feels incredibly unique, which is fantastic because otherwise everybody just copy-pastes Genshin's UI, but it also is simply a pleasure to look at least for me. The same also goes for the characters. While not all characters hit my personal nerve and my personal taste, I especially like Arknight and Yvonne. The latter honestly just being a horny bait, but I guess it worked on me at least. Let's get to a conclusion. Overall, I give Arknights Endfield CBT1 a total score of 9 out of 10. This game feels incredibly polished, and this might as well have been the release version, as literally nothing felt like it was a beta. It just was this polished. I am very much looking forward to the game's full release, and I will certainly add it to my daily gacha and games routine when it does. Whether or not I will make guides for it, probably. I already started to seeing the game, so yeah, we will see. Go subscribe to my Endfield channel just in case I do, and I'm gonna be honest, I probably will. Peace.